There are places in your life that reveal more about you than you realize. Quiet, seemingly innocuous places where you rarely stop to think, but which profoundly influence your mood, your rest, your thoughts, and yes, even your spiritual life. One of those places is your bedroom, that space where you begin each day and where your day ends. That small refuge where your mind is laid bare, where your emotions find their true weight, where your soul is left defenseless against what has not yet healed. Many people believe their spiritual life depends solely on how often they pray, how much faith they express, or how many challenges they overcome. But they overlook something essential. The human heart is deeply sensitive to its environment. We are not isolated beings. We are beings influenced. What you see, what you keep, what you consume, what you allow to remain close to you, all of this affects your soul in ways that sometimes go unnoticed. And although we may not like to admit it, there are objects that keep a wound alive, feed a shadow, or reinforce a lie we carry within us. There are things you keep in your room that don't seem harmful, but they act as a silent weight. Not because they have spiritual power in themselves, but because they represent a part of your life you never surrendered to God, a story you didn't close, a fear you continue to nurture, an identity that no longer belongs to you, a guilt you still hold on to, a distraction that prevents you from listening, a memory that binds you to the past. And sooner or later, what you keep near your bed ends up holding a part of your soul. Human beings have always had a tendency to surround themselves with things that promise security, power, comfort, or control. And often we keep objects without truly understanding why we hold on to them. I'm not asking you to look at your room with fear, but with honesty, with a soft but truthful light. Ask yourself, what am I allowing to sleep with me? What am I unknowingly letting into my inner world? What objects reflect wounds I haven't yet surrendered to God? There are objects that carry memories that don't heal, but rather reopen wounds. Photographs that keep you trapped in a love that no longer exists. Letters that feed a silent guilt. Gifts from people who represented pain, not blessing. Things you look at unintentionally, but each time you do, your heart tightens, your soul remembers, your spirit dims a little more. It's not about running from the past, but about letting God determine which part of the past should still live with you. There are memories that are a bridge to gratitude, and there are memories that are an anchor to sadness. If there are objects in your room that every time you see them drag you down more than they lift you up, then they aren't memories, they are chains. There are other objects that represent misguided spiritual paths, things you adopted in moments of confusion, objects you believed protected you, amulets you thought brought you luck, symbols you used when you didn't understand that the only true refuge is God. It's not uncommon for people to hold on to objects seeking comfort in moments of fear or despair. But when those objects occupy a space that belongs to God, they begin to distort faith. Authentic faith cannot coexist with superstition. True peace does not need amulets. Real comfort does not come from objects. It comes from trust. Anything you keep in your room as if it had a special power to protect you beyond God slowly becomes a spiritual substitute. Not because it is inherently bad, but because it takes the place of what should truly sustain you. There are also things that pollute your mind, not spiritually, but emotionally. Screens that drain your energy before bed, books that fill you with anxiety, objects that foster comparisons, complexes, and insecurities, things that don't seem harmful, but if you look closely, they're shaping your heart more than you realize. And if something shapes your heart without God's involvement, sooner or later, your soul will pay the price. Some people keep objects in their rooms that symbolize excesses, habits that distance them from inner discipline, decisions they struggle to acknowledge, things that represent a life they no longer want to live, but that they haven't yet dared to let go of. And the curious thing is that simply looking around a room is enough to see a snapshot of someone's soul. Objects accumulated out of fear of letting go, empty objects trying to fill an inner void, objects that speak of past identities, objects that hold silent shame. Your bedroom is a mirror of your inner self. What you keep there says more about you than any spiritual sermon. You can pray sincerely, you can attend church, you can talk about faith, but if you sleep surrounded by things that feed anxiety, the past, guilt, comparison, superstition, or distraction, then your soul finds no rest. Because rest isn't just about closing your eyes, but about freeing your heart. There are objects you shouldn't keep because they were part of a painful past, but now with time they've become part of the scenery. You've grown accustomed to them. You no longer consciously see them, but your soul does. Your soul remembers. Your soul feels. Your soul carries them. And God doesn't want you to sleep surrounded by old shadows. God wants your room to be a place of peace, not an emotional archive filled with things that weigh more than they seem. There's something we must acknowledge. Objects don't possess spiritual power in themselves, but they do have emotional power because of what they represent. And what stirs the heart affects the soul. What you keep close to you influences you. What you allow into your inner world ultimately shapes your identity. That's why it's so important to choose wisely what you let into your room. God doesn't call you to fill your life with things. He calls you to fill your life with light. He invites you to understand what things draw you closer to Him and what things distract you from His presence, not because He is jealous of your memories, but because He is jealous of your freedom. There's something fascinating about the relationship between the human soul and the spaces it inhabits. You'll notice that when there's disorder within you, there's also disorder outside. And when objects have been occupying places they no longer belong in for too long, that also reveals something about your spiritual life. Sometimes objects remain because you haven't dared to make the decisions life is urging you to make. Other times they stay because they remind you of an identity you're afraid to relinquish, or because they represent an old version of yourself that, although it no longer serves you, still feels familiar. God never asks you to remain anchored to what you no longer are. He invites you to move forward to a place where your heart is free to receive His grace. But how can the soul open itself to the new if it remains surrounded by the old? How can someone rest who sleeps in a space filled with burdensome memories? How can someone hear God who goes to bed each night surrounded by things that speak louder than their inner voice? One of the most dangerous objects we tend to keep in our rooms, not because they have inherent power, but because of what they represent, are those that reopen old wounds. Letters written from a place of pain, photographs that keep alive a grief that should have healed long ago, gifts from toxic relationships that left you with more sadness than love, objects that every time your eyes fall upon them, open a crack inside you. You don't notice because you've grown accustomed to seeing them, but your soul does. A part of you tenses up every time you look at that object, even if you don't consciously recognize it. And that tension builds up, it's stored away, it becomes a whisper that tells you you haven't healed yet. God doesn't want you to sleep surrounded by open wounds. He wants you to sleep surrounded by peace. There are also objects that represent commitments that no longer exist. A ring kept not out of love, but out of fear of letting go. A letter that promised something that was never fulfilled. A memento of someone who is no longer part of your life, but whom you continue to hold on to as if keeping it gives you an identity. When you keep objects that represent broken bonds, you are not honoring history. You are preventing God's grace from writing a new one. There's a particularly dangerous object that almost no one talks about: belongings that create emotional dependency. Clothes you keep because they symbolize a version of yourself you no longer want to be. Objects you used in dark times. Accessories that reinforce an image of yourself that God has already restored. Things that make you a prisoner of who you once were. Your bedroom should be a place where your soul knows it can rest, not where it is forced to remember all the battles that exhausted it. And then there are the objects that represent fears. Things you kept because you believed they protected you. An energy bracelet, an amulet that attracts luck, a symbol bought in a moment of spiritual confusion, a figurine that promised control, security, balance, inner power. None of these objects has the power to harm your soul, but they do have the power to weaken your faith, because without realizing it, your heart begins to lean on something that is not God. God doesn't compete with amulets. He doesn't share His place with objects that promise protection. Not because He's jealous of an object, but because He's jealous of your trust. When you keep things that represent fear, your room ceases to be a refuge. and becomes a reminder of your fragility. And God wants to replace that fragility with trust. There are also other kinds of objects that harm your soul without you even realizing it, those that fuel your distraction. Your bedroom should be a place where you can breathe, where you can listen to your heart, where you can reconnect with yourself. But many people turn it into a space of constant noise, screens left on until late, notifications that explode right before bed, books that don't enrich you, but instead absorb your mind and fill it with anxiety, collections of things you don't use, but that occupy your thoughts. Your bedroom is a sacred space because it's where you rest and where you wake up. The first words you hear and the last images you see profoundly shape your inner self. If the last thing you see before closing your eyes is something that distracts or consumes you, your soul cannot find rest. If the first thing you see upon waking is worry, comparison, or noise, your spirit begins the day without clarity. Your soul was created for peace, not chaos, for clarity, not saturation, for presence, not distraction. There's another type of object that many overlook, those that represent habits that harm your soul. Things you used during a period of excess, objects that were part of behaviors that distanced you from your purpose, physical reminders of decisions you don't want to repeat. Keeping them allows those old versions of yourself to continue having a voice. And that voice, however small, has an influence. Sometimes the greatest spiritual act you can perform isn't an elaborate prayer, but an honest decluttering, opening a drawer, looking at an object, asking yourself, does this still have a place in the person I am today? And if the answer is no, then you're not losing an object. You're reclaiming inner space. God doesn't simply want to give you spiritual peace. He wants to teach you how to create spaces where that peace can dwell. Because peace doesn't live amidst what confuses, distracts, hurts, paralyzes, or chains us. Peace needs space. There's something you may never have been told. You can't fill your life with light if you keep holding on to objects that belong to the darkness of your past. I'm not talking about magic or superstition. I'm talking about emotional memory, about wounds you haven't let go of, about identities that are no longer yours, about fears that still haunt you. God wants to enter your room. Yes, that physical space. He wants that place to be a small temple where your soul finds rest, but he won't force his way in. He invites you to return that space to him with your own hands. To say, Lord, I no longer need this. This no longer defines me. This is no longer part of what you are doing in me. And when you take that step, your room begins to change. But more importantly, you begin to change. There is something profoundly spiritual about the way you decide what stays with you and what needs to leave your life. And your bedroom, even if you don't think of it that way, is an intimate reflection of those decisions. It's not just a physical space, it's an emotional, mental, and sometimes even spiritual space. The bedroom becomes a sanctuary or a place of torment, depending on what you allow to live within it. When you fill your room with objects that no longer represent who you are, your soul lives surrounded by echoes of the past. And those echoes, though silent, influence you. They constantly remind you of what you've left behind, or what you wish you could leave behind, or what you never wanted to face. And it's incredible how a small object stored in a drawer can occupy so much space in your spiritual memory. One of the most confusing things for the soul are those that represent identities that no longer exist. For example, clothes that hold a version of yourself that is no longer healthy. Accessories or items you bought when your life was guided by fear, insecurity, or the need for approval. Objects that remind you of commitments you no longer honor or appearances you no longer wish to maintain. Every time your eyes see these objects, your soul hears an old message. What if you were still that person? God isn't calling you to be the old version of yourself. He's calling you to be the person he's shaping you into. And your room should be a space where that identity can grow, not where the old one haunts you. There are other objects that represent constant distractions. Things you use to avoid thinking, to avoid feeling, to avoid necessary internal conversations. How often does the room fill with physical noises, screens, notifications, lights, unnecessary objects that act as barriers between you and your inner self? Every distraction you allow to linger while you rest is one less opportunity for your soul to listen to itself and to listen to God. Constant distraction is one of the greatest enemies of the spiritual life, not because screens or objects are inherently bad, but because they occupy the space that belongs to silence. And without silence, the soul can never find itself. It's also important to talk about objects that come charged with negative emotional energy. Not mystical energy, but real emotional memory. Things that remind you of moments of shame, loss, decisions that hurt you or others. Objects that, even if they seem harmless, trigger emotions within you that you haven't fully healed. These objects keep open wounds that God wants to close. Emotional healing isn't just about therapy or prayer, it's also about honesty. There are things God can't take away because you haven't let go of them. And often, letting go isn't an abstract act. It's a physical one. It's opening a drawer, taking out an object, looking it in the eye and saying, I don't need this anymore. I am no longer this. I don't want to carry this anymore. That simple act can be profoundly spiritual. Another type of object you should get rid of are those born from comparison. Things you bought to look like others, to prove something, to fill a void with appearances. Every time you see them, they remind you that there was a time when you didn't feel good enough. And even though you've moved on, even though you've matured, those objects still whisper an old message, you were never good enough. God doesn't want you to sleep with that voice close to you. Your room should be a place where your soul hears words of truth, not comparisons. Where you rest in who you are, not in who others think you should be. Where God can remind you of your worth without interference. It's also important to talk about objects that represent addictions or harmful habits. Things you keep, even though you know they distance you emotionally and spiritually from your purpose. Objects associated with excess, toxicity, and behaviors that destroyed you in the past. Keeping them doesn't mean you'll fall again, but it does mean you haven't yet completely freed yourself from that identity. And God wants to give you real freedom, not just the appearance of it. Sometimes you think an object means nothing because it's stored away, hidden in a box, unused. But the soul remembers. And as long as something exists in your inner space, a part of you holds on to it. The act of discarding something isn't losing it. It's freeing your heart from something that no longer belongs to your story. There's another type of object that few people talk about, those that represent anxiety, things you accumulate just in case, objects you keep for fear of not having enough in the future. Papers, documents, clothes, books, tools, mementos, new things and broken things, all mixed together in a drawer you rarely open. Excessive accumulation doesn't stem from abundance. It stems from fear, fear of the future, fear of lack, fear of emptiness. And sleeping surrounded by fear affects the soul. God doesn't want you to live from a place of fear, but from a place of trust. He doesn't want you to fill your life with things that claim to give you security, but to fill your heart with the certainty of His care. Excessive clutter in your room isn't just physical disorder, it's emotional disorder. And sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is clean out a drawer. Say, I'm not going to keep things out of fear. I'm going to live from a place of freedom. And when you do that, you don't just change your room, you change your heart. There are objects that represent misguided ambitions. Things you bought when you were seeking success, recognition, or validation. Objects that now remind you of a time when your worth depended on what you achieved, not who you were. Keeping them can keep alive an inner voice that competes with the voice of God, that voice that tells you that you are not enough unless you achieve more, do more, have more. But God wants your room to be a place where that voice is silenced, a place where you can wake up each morning without the burden of having to prove yourself, a place where you can rest each night knowing that your worth is in Him, not in your accomplishments. And then there are the objects that represent spiritual darkness from the past, not because they have power, but because they were created from beliefs or practices that distanced you from God. Even if you no longer believe in those things, even if you no longer practice them, keeping them is keeping a door open to a stage that no longer belongs to you. God wants to close that door. He wants to seal it with light, not with fear. What you keep close to you silently shapes your spirit. That's why it's so important to allow God into that physical space as well. He doesn't ask you to live without possessions, but rather to live without attachments. Let your room be a place of true rest, a place where your heart can breathe. There comes a point in one's spiritual life when one understands that faith isn't lived only in church, nor only in prayer, nor only in times of crisis, but also in the quiet details that surround your daily life. And one of those details is the space where you sleep, where you wake up, where no one sees you, where you are more yourself than anywhere else. Your room is perhaps, without you realizing it, an extension of your soul. And when you fill it with things that no longer represent life, hope, or clarity, your inner self also begins to accumulate unnecessary shadows. But when you clean it, when you eliminate what no longer brings light, when you decide that your rest deserves to be a refuge and not a reminder of the past, something profound begins to stir within you. Sometimes we think the spiritual life is too abstract, too mysterious, too lofty. But God also moves in the simple things, in the everyday, in the domestic. God enters your room not only when you are praying, but when you are willing to see your life as He sees it, with sincerity, without excuses, without fear of closing chapters. There are objects that, when you let go, seem small, but in reality, they release something big. They release guilt, they release sadness, they release confusion. They release the old identity you no longer want to carry. They release the fear of moving forward. They release attachment to a past that can no longer give you life, because it's not the object itself. It's what it represented. And when you let it go, your soul breathes a little lighter. When you decide to remove from your room whatever disturbs your peace, something beautiful happens. You begin to perceive God more clearly, not because He wasn't there before, but because by removing the noise, the shadows, and the distractions, you finally created a space where you can hear Him, a place where His presence doesn't compete with old voices, a place that invites rest instead of causing you tension, a place where you can be honest, vulnerable, real. Perhaps you haven't considered it, but your room can be transformed into a silent altar, not an altar of objects, but an altar of intention, a space where the soul prepares to live with greater clarity, a place where you begin to let go, to declutter, to decide, to heal, where you can look around and say, this uplifts me, this doesn't, this aligns with who I am now, this no longer does. And when you do that, you're doing something profoundly spiritual. You're saying yes to God within your everyday life. You're letting Him into your most human, most private, most forgotten corners. You're giving Him permission to illuminate even those spaces you didn't consider important. But God doesn't divide your life into the sacred and the ordinary. For Him, everything is fertile ground for healing, teaching, and transformation. So when you finish watching this video, perhaps the most spiritual thing you can do today isn't a long prayer, but rather opening a drawer, looking at a shelf, examining a box that hasn't been touched in years, asking yourself honestly, does this bring light or steal peace? Does it represent who I am today or who I've stopped being? Does it draw me closer to God or distract my heart? And if you discover something that no longer belongs to your story, don't be afraid to let it go. You're not losing an object, you're reclaiming an inner space, a space that God wants to fill with rest, clarity, and truth. Your bedroom can become one of the places where God speaks to you most. But to hear Him, sometimes you need to let go of what no longer has a place. When you eliminate what's in the way, you don't just tidy your space, you tidy your soul. Because God doesn't just want to enter your life, He wants to enter your peace during your break, on your night, in your dawn. And it all begins with a simple, humble, and profoundly transformative act, deciding what deserves to stay close to your heart and what should leave your room forever.